Okay, the time is 12:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the Office of Planning and Development's monthly Planning Lunches at Noon April webinar. Today we are joined by Jessica Wilcox from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, who is the Clean Cities Coalition Coordinator. We're also joined by Jackson Kaspari, who is the Resilience Coordinator and Assistant City Planner with the City of Dover, New Hampshire. A couple of housekeeping matters before we go ahead and get started. We've turned off all attendees' microphones and cameras, but you should still have access to the chat functionality to ask questions. I'll go through that in a minute. You can check out OPD's Planning and Zoning Training website page at this URL here below, where there'll be where there's slides and recordings of all completed webinars in the plan series, and we'll also be posting the slides and recording from this webinar sometime next week. There's also a schedule of upcoming webinars there, as well as a link to a short anonymous survey that we'd kindly ask you to complete at the conclusion of this webinar. So as I mentioned, you all should have access to the chat box functionality, the little kind of box you can see here on this slide. You can put questions in throughout the presentation, and our speakers, when we get to the Q&A session at the end, will respond to questions in the chat box. I already talked about kind of who our two presenters are. We're going to begin with Jessica giving a presentation titled Infrastructure Investments, Paving the Way for Electric Vehicles. And then we will hear from Jackson about the City of Dover's EV regulations, followed by a Q&A session at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Jessica. And Jessica, feel free to go ahead and share your screen.
Let me know if you can see that okay. Great.
Looks great.
Great, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Noah, for the introduction. I'm Jessica Wilcox. I work with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services as a transportation specialist, and I coordinate our state's Clean Cities Coalition, which basically we work with towns and cities, so it's planners and other staff as well as vehicle fleets, public and private businesses, and we support their efforts to choose low and zero emissions vehicles or transportation options. So this includes the gamut of propane, natural gas, biodiesel even, and the topic today, which is electric vehicles, has been one on the minds of a lot of our stakeholders here in New Hampshire. So let's talk a little bit more about all of this funding and that's coming down the pike basically, and how you can take advantage of that or utilize resources that are at your disposal to basically help pave the way for electric vehicles. So electric vehicles, you're going to hear me refer to them as EVs throughout this presentation, and there's another acronym that I'm going to use, or abbreviation that I'm going to use, which is EVSE, to refer to EV charging infrastructure. So just a heads up on that. So just so we're on the same page with electric vehicles, there's two different types. There's all battery electric vehicles, which basically are powered by a battery. They don't have an engine or a transmission. Then there's the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which are powered by a battery and a gas engine. And that gas engine basically switches seamlessly on as soon as the battery charge runs out. So to complicate things even further, electric vehicles are referred to as PEVs, or plug-in electric vehicles. So there's BEVs, battery electric vehicles, PHEVs, which is plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and then they're encapsulated under this larger title of plug-in electric vehicles. So what are the benefits? Why is everybody talking about electric vehicles? So obviously we know that they have a big impact on reducing emissions with the fact that they're zero tailpipe emissions, that they are a gateway to incorporating more renewables into our electric grid, that they're quieter, and basically the technology makes them amazing and fun to drive. When you incorporate all of your fuel and maintenance savings, they can be cheaper to operate. than an internal combustion engine. And then you have the convenience of leaving your house fully charged. As you can see from these graphs, even when you incorporate power plant emissions into electric vehicles, they still come out cleaner on the other end. And according to an e-gallon tool that the Department of Energy publishes, they're about $1 cheaper to drive. And this was several months ago before we've seen this increase in fuel prices. So currently, there are about 4,800 electric vehicles registered in the state of New Hampshire, and that's what we've been able to capture based on Department of Motor Vehicle data. And that, as you can see, that's been increasing year over year, particularly in counties such as Hillsborough and Rockingham. But we think that that's going to spike even more because mainstream automakers are investing significantly into electric vehicles. You can kind of find out a little bit more about which EVs are available just in the Northeast alone through that link on this slide, which I'll share with you guys later. But there are actually over 40 different models of electric vehicles currently available and about 35 different makes and models being touted and planned for being released later this year and into next year. So a lot is coming down the pike. And that market is growing, right? We're seeing electrification move into not just the light duty market where it's been, but into the medium and heavy duty with electric vans and pickup trucks, as well as even in the refuse truck and street sweeping department. They work great in lawn equipment and forklifts as well. And heavy duty electric vehicles are starting to come online through companies like Lion Electric and BYD, who builds an electric transit bus. In fact, Nashua Transit has a hybrid electric transit bus and a couple of them in their fleet. So let's talk a little bit more about EVSE, and that's EV charging infrastructure, also called electric vehicle supply equipment. That's where that abbreviation comes from. There's currently 3 different types of charging. There's level 1, which basically every EV comes with a level 1 charger. It has a J1772 connector that plugs right into the electric vehicle, and then you plug the other end into a standard 3-prong wall outlet. But this can only give you about 2 to 5 miles of range for every hour of charging. So this is why we look at, for municipalities, for towns and cities here in New Hampshire, level 2 charging makes a little bit more sense. This is once again that standard connector, that J1772 connector. And these basically require a 240 volt outlet, similar to a dryer plug. This could offer 10 to 25 miles of range per hour of charge. So once again, invites the EV driver to plug in and kind of hang out a little bit where they are so that they can get a little bit more range to get to their next place. Then there's direct current fast charging. Some people call it level 3. It's actually not, it's just fast charging. This can provide 60 to 80 miles of range for every 20 minutes of charging. So really kind of geared towards streamlining travel. Think areas like Hooks at Rest area that has Tesla fast charging there. These can come in actually different levels of power. 50 kilowatts being on the low end, up to 350 kilowatts, and even talk of 450 kilowatts. So obviously, the higher the kilowatts, the faster the charge. Now, the thing about direct current fast charging is that it actually has 3 different connector types. So I mentioned the Hooks at Rest area has Tesla charging stations, which unfortunately can only charge Tesla vehicles. So the other 2 kind of what we call universal connectors are the SAE Combined Charging System, or CCS, and then there's CHAdeMO. Now, the difference is that SAE Combined Charging System traditionally has been charging American made and German manufactured vehicles. And CHAdeMO has been more for Asian vehicles like Nissan and Mitsubishi. What we're starting to see now, though, is a transition away from CHAdeMO and strictly towards that SAE combined charging system, as Nissan and Mitsubishi are now starting to make EVs that use the CCS connector. And so until now, direct current fast charging stations have offered both the SAE combined and the CHAdeMO. We're starting to see now with this new funding that's coming, there's a preference that's going to come through as they're starting to kind of identify that CCS as being a preferential or standard for new charging stations. So where does the infrastructure currently exist, or what does the landscape look like here in New Hampshire? Currently in New Hampshire, we have about 15 universal locations, so that does not include Tesla. These are great because EV drivers, they tend to, unlike conventional vehicle drivers where we kind of wait for the gas tank to run low before we fill it up, EV drivers like to top off. So they may go to a location, get a little bit more juice, go on to the next location, and every time they stop, they want to get a little bit more juice to kind of get some more range in their vehicle. Now, if you look at, we have 15 here in the state, and those are really kind of centered around the Upper Valley and southern New Hampshire and the seacoast. We really have like a drought up in the North Country. That's where our desert exists. If you look at neighboring states, here we have 15. Vermont and Maine have double that, and Massachusetts 6 times as much. In terms of the level 2 charging, which I mentioned is great for towns and cities here in New Hampshire, once again, we're seeing this drought in the North Country. We've got about 122 total universal level 2 chargers. But if you look at our neighboring states, once again, Vermont and Maine have double that, and Massachusetts 16 times as much. So we've got some work to do. So let's talk about where we would put these EV chargers if we're going to start installing them in our communities. Now, I mentioned level 2 public charging makes the most sense for communities, and this is because not only does it invite folks to EV drivers to come into your downtown and to park and kind of hang out, it also is much less expensive when compared to the direct current fast charging. So as you can see on this slide, typical EV charging costs can range up for a level 2 from $500 up to $8,000, with installation ranging from $600 to $13,000. Why the big range? Because installing level 2 charging stations really depends on what kind of stands in the way. Do you have to dig up the concrete parking lot? What do you have? What kind of construction has to be done to get the chargers in? So this is why we also say when there's new parking lot renovations or new buildings going in, getting the extra conduit and wiring in place to support EV charging, even if you're not going to install it till down the road, makes much more sense, because you're basically saving all that upfront construction costs. You don't have to tear up that parking lot later on. Direct current fast charging, great for travel corridors like I-93, I-95. Doesn't necessarily invite the EV driver to hang out as long because they can, kind of get 80% of a charge in about 20 minutes. And as you can see from the prices here, the cost from 15 to 40,000 and the installation from 8 to 50. Combine that all together, you're looking at potentially 6 figures in getting that direct current fast charging in the ground. So we say charging really makes sense in public places, especially in workplaces where folks are going to maybe go to work for 8 hours and they can plug in, and it invites, EV drivers to come and work in those workplaces as well. So this is where we're telling people are good places to charge. We also recommend that towns and cities think about their municipal fleets, their light duty fleets currently. I don't know if everybody on the call knows this, but our towns and cities here in New Hampshire can purchase off of the state vehicle contract and get basically a better price for electric vehicles. This was the last contract that we have, and as you can see, we had the Leaf, the Chevy Bolt on there, and the new Chevy Bolt EUV, as we're starting to see this transition away from just the standard light duty vehicles into sport utility vehicles and the like. We also suggest that parking lots, park and rides, we have so many of them here in our state, and parking garages are a great place for EV charging, and invite folks to plug in and walk around the downtown area. We suggest that school districts think about incorporating electric school buses into their fleets, and to also consider installing charging for students and staff. We've talked with transit companies about electrifying transit fleets. As I mentioned, Nashua Transit has taken a step in that direction. And the Environmental Protection Agency is coming out with some really great funding through the larger infrastructure bill to support clean school buses deployments here in our state, with $5 billion coming over 5 years. And so this is accessible for our state and local governments, for certain contractors. We've got more information coming on this program. It's actually just being released and written, and hopefully going to get published at the end of April, and hopefully that funding will become available this month. We suggest to our towns and cities to try to become an EV hotspot. We use words like EV friendly, where you've got charging accessible to folks to come and plug in and visit your restaurants and your stores, to feel like they can to get that kind of support and get a few miles of range while they're hanging out in your town or your city. And that's just some examples of different events that we've done around the state. So where do you start? We do generally tell folks that reach out to Clean Cities here at DES that the place to start is with the EV charging station provider or installer. So maybe reach out to a few. Many of them will offer to do a free consultation with you to kind of understand what type of fleet are you looking to support. Are you looking to support a municipal fleet, or is this for customers or visitors or a workforce? They can kind of help guide you in terms of what types of charging might make the most sense. And then from there, reach out to the utility And honestly, the utilities say contact the number on your utility bill. So whoever that representative is, that's the person to start with. And from there, they can kind of advise you on what type of electrical supply that a site might need. Maybe they'll look at your site and say, there's a better site somewhere here in the area. So definitely coordinating with your utility and making sure you have those good connections is a great place to start. The Volkswagen Settlement website currently has some utility assessment forms that may be of interest to folks that are curious about what kinds of questions do I need to ask the utility, and what might they be able to help me with. Some snapshots from those documents on this slide. The utilities are very interested in electrification and supporting that. They're currently putting forth rate cases and dockets before the Public Utilities Commission to address some of the growing pains, if you will, of electrifying vehicles, such as demand charges. There was a situation in the town of Derry where they had installed some fast chargers and were experiencing demand charges on their utility bill. And this is because there wasn't consistent EV charging at those sites. So intermittently, a car would pull in and plug in, and that instant demand on that charging station kind of caused a spike in their electric use for that site. And so they unfortunately had to pay demand charges and ended up shutting down those stations while they're trying to work with the utility to kind of work that out. There's also support from the utilities to try to provide make-ready programs, and that basically installs all of the electrical supply up to the stub, up to where you would install the hardware itself. And also some efforts to generate some time of use rate incentives. And this is to basically support what time EV drivers plug in, because ultimately electricity costs a lot less overnight, right? When we're not using and not plugged into our all of our electrical outlets. So they're trying to incentivize overnight charging as opposed to charging from that 5 to 7 range when everybody's kind of turning lights on and starting to use electricity. So let's talk about a little bit of funding that's currently going in to support the build out of charging infrastructure in our state. That's the Volkswagen Settlement, and many of you may already have heard about it. State of New Hampshire's receiving about $31 million from the Volkswagen Settlement, and 15% of that has been dedicated to EV charging infrastructure. So New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services is the lead agency. They had released an EV charging funding opportunity last September, and that was to seek direct current fast charging sites along certain transportation corridors here in our state. This was open to anybody. It was looking at different types of ownerships of the property ownerships, whereas the applicant didn't necessarily need to own the property or even own the charging. You could work with a vendor that might be interested in that, or a developer. We were looking at folks, developing partnerships and really putting forth good proposals. And so DES did receive about 30 proposals from 14 different applicants, and unfortunately, some of those didn't meet the minimum requirements, so that got adjusted down to 43 different options representing 35 sites across 25 different New Hampshire towns and cities, meeting those minimum qualifications. So those applications are now before a scoring committee that's comprised of representatives from the Department of Environmental Services, from the Department of Transportation, and from the Department of Energy. And until those contracts go through governor and council and are awarded, they are confidential. So stay tuned for more information on that. And there's the link to the VW site if you're interested in learning more about that funding opportunity and also looking at those utility forms I mentioned. So in terms of what might result from this Volkswagen funding opportunity, we are looking for sites that would have no less than 2 direct current fast chargers, as well as potentially co-located level 2 charging. So we're thinking about the fact that not only would this provide that fast charge, but it would also support electric cars that maybe were made a little bit earlier and can't accept fast charging, because believe it or not, some EVs early on could not accept fast charging. So we're also looking to provide some level 2 charging there as well. That the minimum power should be no less than 50 kilowatts, and that we were targeting 9 different travel corridors around our state, including Route 16, I-89, Route 101, et cetera. We're trying to create kind of this backbone of charging east-west, east-west, north-south around our state, so that folks can travel and get to where they need to go. So additionally, like compounding, we're starting to go from the state level, we're moving out now, we're seeing all this funding coming through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which you may have formerly known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So the BIL is investing a ton of money to get towards certain goals. We'll look at the first target, that is by 2030, US electric vehicle sales will represent 50% of new cars sold, right? So this is the target, and behind that target, we're getting a charging action plan in place. The goal is to create a nationwide network of EV charging that adheres to certain guidance and standards, that's focused on our corridors, and that follows this care: convenient, affordable, reliable, and equitable. So from this funding, a joint office of energy and transportation has been developed to provide technical assistance and resources. And additionally, funding is going to be delving into sourcing for EV batteries. A lot of people have heard about issues with mining for lithium, and how that is a resource that we don't have a ton of access to. So how can we kind of increase domestic manufacturing and supply? Also looking at battery recycling. What do we do with all these batteries when they're no longer viable? And also looking at deploying renewable energy in association with EV charging. So think solar in support of these EV charging sites as well. So let's delve into this National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program a little bit more. So NEVI is a program under the umbrella of the larger bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed last year. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program is basically investing in funding to meet a national goal of 500,000 EV chargers by 2030. Now, currently here in the nation, we have about 100,000, so we've got a little ways to go here. But the BIL is investing a total of $7.5 billion into this NEVI program. $5 billion of that will be administered through formula funds. So $1 billion a year for the next 5 years. New Hampshire is supposed to be receiving about 17 million overall, and in the first year, about 2.5 million of this. This will not solely fund 100% of a site, but amazingly funds about 80% of a site, with 20% of that cost share needing to come from private or state funds. And then another 2.5 billion of discretionary funding is set aside to fund another couple of programs, one of which is another corridor-based program, as well as community charging programs. So that's where we kind of see opportunities for our towns and our cities here in New Hampshire, because the NEVI program is really going to be a corridor-focused program, and that funding initially is going to be coming to our state New Hampshire Department of Transportation. But we see this discretionary grant program, which we're still waiting for more information about, as potentially being an opportunity for New Hampshire towns and cities. So there is currently program guidance that's been released about that NEVI program. That's that $5 billion over 5 years. It's talking about what our New Hampshire Department of Transportation needs to do in order to access that funding. We're going to have to develop a state deployment plan that's going to be due August 1st. It's giving us some guidance about what eligible projects look like. As I mentioned, there's going to be a target on our transportation corridors. Think I-89, I-95, how that program should be administered, and what types of technical assistance is available. So New Hampshire Department of Transportation, as I mentioned, is the lead on this. In fact, Mike Moser with our New Hampshire DOT is going to be our lead point person, and he's a great guy. He's looking to plan a lot of opportunities for public comment on this. So if you're interested in getting tuned into that, please reach out to me. I can get you added to a mailing list for that. But he's going to be leading the charge in terms of developing this deployment plan for our state. Funding priorities are for installation, operation, and maintenance, so the whole system of EV charging. It's going to be obviously geared towards our corridors, initially the interstate highway system, followed by the national highway system. These sites need to be publicly accessible. There's going to be a focus on rural and disadvantaged communities. And what a site looks like is basically that direct current fast charging every 50 miles and no farther away than 1 travel mile off of the exit. So basically real close to the highway, and a lot of power at these sites. They're looking at greater than at least 4 150 kilowatt DC fast chargers with that combined charging system port. As I mentioned, there's an effort here to try to streamline and zone in on one of these types of technologies. Now, once that nationwide network is fully built out, if there are any remaining funds, New Hampshire DOT can decide what types of charging, whether they want to invest in a different level of charging, such as level 2, whether they might want to invest it in different areas of communities as opposed to just off the highways. So, remains to be seen how New Hampshire DOT will ultimately spend that funding and whether or not there will be any remaining. But we will have some license to do with any remaining funding as we wish. So the state EV infrastructure deployment plan, there was a template that was released by that Joint Office of Energy and Transportation back in March. This is describing how the state agencies need to coordinate. So New Hampshire DOT has already reached out to DES in coordinating that capacity. There's going to be a big public engagement aspect of this. So opportunity, as I mentioned, for our towns and cities to weigh in. But the great thing is that by August 1st, we don't have to know all the answers to this plan. This is going to be a living document. We will have plenty of opportunity over time to hear from our towns and cities and to hear from our stakeholders, to hear from planners, to give feedback toward this plan as it's a living document. And initially, we just need to get the methodology in place and kind of talk about how we're going to go about this, how we're going to engage the public in feedback, how we're going to cite and analyze the existing resources that we have to move this forward. So it's going to get updated on a yearly basis. Now, that discretionary grant program, where I mentioned there's opportunity for New Hampshire towns and cities, $2.5 billion overall, going to be split down into two buckets of $1.25 billion each. Part of that focused on corridors, the other part focused on community. The challenge with this funding is that not only will it support electric vehicle charging, but it could also support other types of alternative fueling stations, such as hydrogen, such as propane and natural gas, to support some of the heavy duty fleets that do exist already. For example, once again, Nashua Transit System has compressed natural gas transit buses. So there's a lot of states and businesses across the nation that are incorporating other types of alternative fuels. Once again, a big focus on low and moderate income neighborhoods, rural areas, disadvantaged communities. This is kind of all we know about the discretionary program right now, but additional guidance is expected later this year in November. So what don't we know? We don't quite know the minimum standards and requirements for EV charging projects, for what the maintenance is going to involve, for what types of networking and data collection is going to be involved. The U.S. Department of Transportation will publish that by May 13th. We don't know a lot of details about that competitive charging and fueling infrastructure program, the discretionary funding that I mentioned. There's also some Buy America requirements and this criteria for what a fully built out corridor will be. Once, as I mentioned, once the corridors are fully built out in New Hampshire, if there are remaining funds, those could be used elsewhere. But what does fully built out mean? So I mentioned corridors, we talk a lot about them. So here in the state of New Hampshire, we actually have corridors that have been designated by the Federal Highway Administration as being official alternative fuel corridors. So how did we go about this? Over the last several years, New Hampshire Department of Transportation and New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services have worked together to submit nominations to the federal highways for different corridors around the state. And so on this slide, you can see the solid green lines and the dotted orange lines are actually identifying our existing electric vehicle corridors. Reason why they're solid and dotted is at the time that this program was opened, you could nominate a corridor as being ready or pending. And ready meant that it had sufficient enough infrastructure to meet the minimum criteria set forth by the federal highways. For example, direct current fast charging every 50 miles and no further than 1 mile from the corridor. That is the existing criteria. That criteria has changed over time. So if a corridor didn't have enough EV charging infrastructure to meet that criteria, they would be designated as pending. The beauty of the NEVI funding, this funding that's coming through the BIL, is that regardless of whether it's been designated as ready or pending, that no longer applies because the criteria has once again changed. So all of these corridors are up for basically support through this funding to get that charging site that that the program identifies, that for 150 kilowatt minimum chargers with the CCS port, as it's allowing us to use that funding to build out these corridors with those types of stations. If you're interested in more about the corridors, there was an article in a newsletter that I published actually last year. You can find it, the link on that site. So what types of charging stations here in the state meet these requirements? So currently it appears that we have about 5 different sites around our state that meet the requirements of the NEVI program, being 1 mile from the exit and having 4 CCS ports, and those are mainly stations that have been put in by Electrify America, which is a subsidiary of Volkswagen, and they received about 2.2 billion back in the day when the Volkswagen Settlement came about to install a nationwide network of charging. So they've been busy, and as you can see from this slide, there are about 5 different locations currently meeting the NEVI requirements in our state. So let's talk a little bit about how planners, how communities can invite investment through the BIL and from other developers that are looking to build out charging infrastructure. And one of the big things will be streamlining the EV charging permitting process. Now, I just want to say a little bit about this. There's a couple of points I can suggest, and I'm going to turn it over to Jackson in a little bit once I get through a couple more slides here. And he's going to tell you a little bit more about how he put these best practices into practice, basically how he made them happen. So here in the state of New Hampshire, we don't have a standard for permitting, right? This is a town by town decision. The state doesn't have one permitting requirement for installing EV charging stations. So it may vary from town to town here in our state. So to the extent that communities can adopt similar permitting requirements, especially for straightforward level 2 charging, which is what we suggest for communities to invite, economic investment in your downtown. To the extent you can adopt similar permitting requirements, the more likely the investment will be made in your community. So now, based on conversations that we've had with EV charging installers and with leading municipalities, by reviewing practices and recommendations, there are some clear steps that you can take. You could standardize the permit review and inspection process. EVSE installers, mainly, these are the guys, the electricians and the folks that are actually doing the legwork here. They report that when required, zoning reviews are usually the lengthiest part of the approval process and are not always necessary because EV charging stations are an accessory use to the principal use of the site, meaning they're usually added to the existing parking areas for already existing sites, right? They've already been developed. Now, some municipalities have actually amended their zoning ordinances to clarify that EV charging is an accessory use that does not require further zoning board approval. In the City of Dover's site review regulations, the definition of an EV charging station explicitly clarifies that it is permitted as an accessory use to any principal use of a site. Some other suggestions from this slide include consolidating the number of required reviews or inspections, or by conducting them simultaneously. And also something as simple as developing a step-by-step checklist and posting that visibly for folks to see. Try to make the permitting process for EV charging stations clear and transparent. As a first step, clearly identify required application materials, where to find the permit application, permitting steps and associated timelines, any fees involved, the points of contact. Online fact sheets might be a great way to kind of pull all that information into one place and have it posted so that if someone, an electrician or installer is looking for it, it's easy to find. Consider offering options to access and submit permit applications electronically, particularly in today's technology-oriented day and age driven world, right? Allowing the permit application process to be conducted online or even through email makes it more convenient and simpler and faster for everybody involved. You might amend local ordinances to count parking spaces for EV charging towards minimum parking requirements. So if you have any minimum parking requirements, which are generally a barrier if EV charging spaces aren't counted as or considered as parking spaces, this might be an area you want to tackle. For example, the town of Seabrook actually removed minimum parking requirements from their zoning standards. Per the town planner, when Electrify America stopped by to discuss investing in a DC fast charging project in their community a few years back, they were actually relieved to find that there were no minimum parking requirements preventing them from utilizing a few nearby parking spaces for a transformer. A way to incentivize the deployment of charging stations, some municipalities have actually adopted ordinances that count charging stations, parking spaces for charging stations as more than one parking space for zoning purposes. For example, in the City of Dover, their site review regulations, they actually cut the paved area fee in half if at least 2% of the parking spaces are for EV charging stations. They've also made an exception to their maximum parking calculation where EV charging stations are included. And finally, the most effective way is just collaborate across our region, share best practices, lessons learned, share your insights. And Clean Cities, I'm happy to be a resource to you all in that process. Feel free to reach out to me. We connect people all the time. And if you've done something great in your community, I'd love to hear about it. On that note, thank you for your time and for your attention on this. I'll turn it back over to Noah, or Noah, if you want to turn it over to Jackson, that's fine by me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. This was very, very informative. So yeah, I'm now going to turn it over to Jackson Kaspari for his presentation on Dover's regulations. So Jackson, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Noah, and thank you, Jessica. You really laid a great foundation there for what I'm about to talk about today.
Okay, great. Looks good. You're all set.
Looks good. Perfect. Thank you. So hello, folks. As they have mentioned, I'm Jackson Kaspari, the Resilience Coordinator and Assistant City Planner for the City of Dover, New Hampshire. And today I'm going to talk about some of the analysis that I put together in support of the electric vehicle supply equipment amendments to our site review regulations and conditional use permit process that Jessica mentioned during her presentation. And much of this analysis I actually did when I was a planning board member and presented it to my fellow planning board members before they voted on these amendments. And since then, the city has hired me full-time as the resilience coordinator. So first, I'm going to cover the various analysis that I conducted, and I'm going to talk about sort of the importance for why we're streamlining and promoting electric vehicle supply equipment in our community. And then I'll dive into the actual site regulation amendments themselves and hopefully highlight a couple examples. So the first thing I did was to conduct a EVSE proximity analysis. I really was just trying to gauge the state of electric vehicle supply equipment as it relates to downtown Dover. So I used City Hall as the center point for this. And the left axis, you can see the number of electric vehicle supply equipment plugs. And then I bin them into proximity mileage categories. So you could see the different EVSE types that Jessica talked to in depth, level 1, level 2, and DC fast charging. So within 10 miles of downtown Dover or City Hall, there were 17 level 2 publicly available plugs and 1 DC fast. Between 10 to 50 miles, you can see 2 level 1, 87 level 2, and 54 DC fast. And then, same analysis for greater than 50 miles. And I've listed the totals in that table on the right. So in total, at the time when I did this, there were 5 publicly available level 1, 197 level 2, and 79 DC fast. So I was also curious and figured that my fellow planning board members would also, be interested in the location use breakdown. So what are the land uses associated in the state of New Hampshire with publicly available charging? And when I did this using Department of Energy data, I found that of all publicly available EVSE, 38% of those plugs were in hospitality settings, so at inns and hotels. And then the next biggest category was car dealerships at 21%. And I found that really interesting because while technically considered public, many folks would not really seek out a car dealership when looking for a place to charge their electric vehicle. Then we go to the next category, which was another category, didn't really, the sites within there didn't fit into the others that I'd mentioned at 11%, parking areas at 10%, and so on. So this tool from the Department of Energy I found to be incredibly useful for bringing in, data-driven decision-making into the process. So it's the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Projection tool from the Department of Energy. And I used some assumptions in this analysis. So I looked at, what we have currently for level 2 in our Dover-Rochester area, and I'll show a map of that momentarily. And I said, okay, if 1% of the lightweight vehicles in the Dover-Rochester area were to go electric, assuming partial support of EVs, meaning that EV drivers have 100% access to home charging, what would the Department of Energy think we need in this region? And they think that we need, greater than 50 publicly available plugs. So that's a 382% increase from what we currently have. So clearly there's a need, and I'm using 1% here, right, for the lightweight vehicles. So that's a very conservative value. And there were some vehicle mix assumptions that went into this. As Jessica showed earlier, they have some more county and regional data available now. So I'm hoping to to tie in some more specific values into the vehicle mix assumptions. But regardless, it's very apparent that we're not ready to meet the large amount of EVs or the large influx of EVs that we're going to see in this region very soon. So this is just that map that I mentioned showing the Dover-Rochester area. This next slide, I did the same exact analysis, but I looked at the state of New Hampshire as a whole. Again, we're looking at level 2 here because as Jessica brought up, I think many communities are really going to look to level 2 charging as their destination charging that they're going to want to support. And that's mainly due to costs and also to bring people into your community for extended periods of time to do shopping, eating at restaurants, etc. So as a whole, at the time, there was 197 publicly available level 2 charging plugs. DOE thinks we need somewhere around 600, so that's a 207% increase. So the state as a whole is doing a bit better than we're doing even in our area. And then, of course, I wanted to bring in, why we care about this, why this is important. Obviously, we're dealing with the implications of climate change, especially on the seacoast with sea level rise. So when you do a comparison of the greenhouse gas emissions for New Hampshire vehicle type, it becomes very apparent. All electric, you're looking at about 1,000 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent per year on average, with gasoline vehicles up around 12,000. And then you can see plug-in hybrids and hybrids falling in between. And in New Hampshire, the transportation sector is the largest sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. So climate change aside, I think we'll see some pretty immediate air quality benefits, especially in urban areas like the city of Dover. And then going beyond just output emissions, I found it really interesting to tie in life cycle emissions comparisons as well. And I hope you find this interesting also. So this brings in emissions associated with production and shipping, et cetera. So if you look at a comparison between gasoline and biofuels and then battery EVs, you can see a huge difference. This is in grams of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilometer, a little bit of a different unit. But you see gasoline biofuels up around 250 with battery EVs in the US for the 2021 to 2038 grid matrix around 100. So that's a large decrease. And then as the grid, as ISO New England hopefully becomes cleaner and cleaner with more renewables supplying that electricity, we would see an even further drop in the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions associated with our EVs. And this is coming from a really good white paper that came out last year by George Beaker. I put up the title there on the screen, so I highly recommend folks check that out if you're interested to learn more. And this slide just takes in some predictions for 2030. So you're looking at ICEV, which is internal combustion engine vehicles versus battery electric vehicles for 2021 cars, and then predictions out to 2030 cars. So currently, or at the time in 2021, BEVs corresponded to 57% to 68% lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And that reduction is projected to increase anywhere between 61% to 76% in 2030. And the BEV uncertainty range is a result of the grid matrix projection. So obviously we don't know exactly where the grid is going to go in terms of a renewable mix, and that's where that uncertainty or error bar comes from. And then under a 100% renewable grid scenario, you could expect a reduction of about 80% when comparing battery electric vehicles to standard combustion vehicles. All right, so now that I've talked about some of the supporting analysis, let's dive into the actual amendments themselves. So these amendments were made to Chapter 153 of our site review regulations. And under our site plan review, we're actually stating that new projects must provide electric vehicle charging readiness based on the following standards. So for all new multifamily residential projects, 5% of the total new parking spaces have to meet EV charging readiness. And for non-residential projects, 2% of the total number of spaces have to meet this. And in all cases, there's a minimum of one space that needs to meet EV charging readiness. So what does EV charging readiness mean? Well, it means that the project has provided one or more dedicated circuits on the electrical panels, such that the panels has a surface and capacity to accommodate the required number of level 2 EVSE, and that's based on the percentages that I just mentioned, and that the conduit has to be installed to allow the addition of all necessary wiring to electrify installed EVSE at those parking spaces without having to excavate to do so. So essentially, the reason that we're promoting this in a development phase is because, like Jessica mentioned, it's much more cost prohibitive if you have to go back into a site and install conduit and dig trenches after the fact. But if you're able to put everything in place during the development stage, during the site work, then it's much more streamlined. And we know that electric vehicles are going to be surging in this region, so having housing that is able to support and accommodate EVs is really important to the city of Dover, hence why we adopted these amendments. And if you look at some examples of projects, we've had about 6 large-scale residential projects that have come through that have had to meet these EV readiness standards. And overall, developers have been fairly accepting of this. So there hasn't been much pushback, and they're understanding that, hey, if you want to come and you want to do projects in Dover, we have some standards that we want you to meet, and this is something that we really care about as a community. And now let's look at the conditional use permit. So in Dover, we have a parking space cap, and that's because we have a real issue with impervious surface. As an urban community, we're well above the NHDES recommendation for impervious surface, and we're obviously contributing to some of the issues with the Great Bay and nitrogen runoff, although we're doing our best to mitigate those. So because of that, and because we have that parking space cap, we figured we could provide some relief, but there would have to be a trade-off, and that would be provided through the CUP process. So for uses that typically result in at least 2 hours or longer of parking, the applicant needs to provide 1 level 2 commercial electric vehicle charging station for every 10 spaces requested over that parking cap. And then for uses that do not typically result in 2 hours or longer activity, that applicant should provide 2 additional spaces that meet our EV readiness requirements for every 10 spaces requested over the parking cap. And those, greater than or less than 2 hours is a little bit subjective, but the planning board has the ultimate authority to determine that, although an applicant can certainly make a case in either direction. And with that, I think we'd be happy to take any questions. A bit of a shorter presentation, but I hope everyone had some good takeaways from this with Jessica and I's talks combined. So thank you for your time.
Very well, thank you so much, both Jessica and Jackson. I'm going to go ahead back and share my screen again, just to give you folks, a reminder about Q&A functionality. So we have about 10 minutes left for questions and answers. There's a couple questions that we'll go through that are currently in the chat box. And then if there's additional questions, feel free to click to open the chat box. And if you don't want to do that, you should also have the ability to press the raise hand button too, if you have something specific you'd like to say. And I can unmute people selectively. So with that, let's look at the questions in the chat box. With me. So Bob Coate is asking, for Dover, I'm wondering why there are no charging stations associated with existing gas stations. That one's for you, Jackson.
So that's an interesting point. We just had a proposed gas station come into the planning office recently, and they actually, due to the number of parking spaces, are requesting a CUP to go over the cap. So it's kind of interesting because they'll have to provide 2 level 2 charging stations, which Obviously, there's some costs associated with that, so they're considering asking the planning board if they can do that in a second phase instead of their first phase. We'll see what the planning board response is. But to date, we don't have any requirements for gas stations unless they're exceeding that parking cap. However, we're encouraging fuel stations to be supportive of EVs, and we're not really encouraging more expansion of traditional, fossil fuel gas stations in Dover. However, in this one certain situation, it did make sense based off of the zoning and the location. So
Great.
I hope that was a little bit helpful, at least.
Yeah, no, definitely helpful. Thank you. And then, Jessica, you would put in the link in the chat box to the EV infrastructure projection tool that Jackson mentioned. Jessica, I think you also, just worth mentioning, had put a number of links of resources at the end of your presentation, which, just so folks know, well, those are examples. As well, that will be in the slides that we'll distribute after the presentation. And then what else? Okay, Dave Katz is asking, to what extent is the New Hampshire utility / electric grid a constraining factor in EV charging deployment?
I'll jump in and just say that I think the utilities are going to be a huge partner in this move to electrify transportation. Here in New Hampshire, we work with all the different utilities: Eversource, Unitil, Liberty, the co-op. I know that the utilities, as I mentioned, have rate cases and dockets before the Public Utilities Commission proposing different programs to support electrification of our transportation and support EV charging build out. As they have mentioned so far, I've talked to Eversource before, and as they've mentioned, the existing grid they believe can sustain, at the current rate of growth of electric vehicles, that the grid can sustain that growth. So, they're continuing to invest in beefing out the grid moving forward as well. I'll also mention the co-op, a huge partner in providing rebates and incentives for their members for commercial and municipal electric vehicle charging installations, for even rebating EVs and electric motorcycles. They're all kind of partnering and coming on the ground with different efforts to support the growth of electric vehicles, and they've been great partners for our Clean Cities Coalition as well. So I think, yeah, they're like I mentioned, they're like the second point of contact if your community is looking to install EV charging, because they can identify where the existing supply for electricity, what's there, what's needed. And Jackson mentioned, even with gas stations, they are good sites. A lot of times they already have the type of three-phase power that's required for the fast charging infrastructure. So a lot of times utilities know where that is and can maybe point in the right direction in your community for those good sites. So they're a huge partner.
Great. I have a hand up from Ben Niles, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Ben, so you should be able to talk. You may need to unmute your phone. Unmute first, Ben.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
So my question is from the standpoint of a residential homeowner. I don't own an electric vehicle. That doesn't mean I won't buy one at some point. But what are the programs that are going to be directed towards residential home charging stations? Because everything I see today is commercial charging stations. My concern is the limited number of cars per hour it can handle in a high traffic area. So if I'm going to buy an electric vehicle, I'm going to have a home charging station, or I'll be driving gasoline.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, like, right now, you're right, Ben. The focus has been on publicly accessible charging, building out this nationwide network of charging. But it's, home charging is key, and I think that's where a lot of the automakers are maybe going to come into play more. There's more of an effort by automakers to start packaging the purchase of an electric vehicle with a charging station, so kind of guiding the consumer's hand in knowing how to install, who to access for electricians and things of that nature. Unfortunately, there doesn't exist any residential rebates or incentives here in the state at this time. We do have this Volkswagen funding where that 15% or 4.6 million was dedicated to EV charging. 3 million of that was used for that funding opportunity that I mentioned that closed recently. There is remaining funding. I don't know if that is something that will be made available at any point in time, to residents of the state, but there may be opportunities through utilities as well to support residential installations. Unfortunately, like I said, nothing exists right now. But the beauty of level 2 charging stations is you can buy one at Lowe's. They're not extremely expensive to install. And a lot of times the dealer, where you're buying your electric car, can give you some insights on how to access electricians and get that done.
Great.
So if I call, just a follow-up, if I call Eversource, they'll be able to tell me if there's adequate lines for the carry the power in my neighborhood, et cetera.
Yep, exactly. Call the representative listed on your utility bill. Mention to them that you're interested in talking to somebody about electric vehicle charging stations. Particularly getting an electric vehicle and having the charging station to support that. And they should be able to get you pointed in the right direction. They're the first point of contact, that representative on your bill. And then from there, they can get you to the right person.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great. We have a couple follow-up comments to that one. Sherry Boschert said, for some drivers, a regular electrical level 1 is enough. It works for her and her Tesla. It depends on your driving habits. DNZ second in that said, I've been using a 120 volt charger for a few months and it's sufficient. We've also gotten a couple questions about, will the slides be available after? Yeah, we're going to compile all the slide decks into one PDF. Which I will make sure everybody emails out to everybody. They'll also be available on the OPD Planning and Zoning webpage, which I'll put up again, the link to that in a second. And I'll also put that in the chat box. And there was a couple other questions. I know we are approaching the hour mark. This is also from Sherry. Could Jackson provide the exact wording of his amendments for others to consider as a template for discussing changes in their cities and towns?
Absolutely. I can, as part of the slides, I could share a link to our site review regulations. I mean, they're all publicly available online. So I can pull that out as a PDF or send a link to the full regulations themselves.
Great. Now, let me just make sure we have another hand up. Let me just make sure that I got everything in the chat box here. Yep, I think so. So we have another hand up from Greg Ames. I'll go ahead and unmute your line, or allow you to unmute. Greg, you'll need to unmute to talk.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for doing the presentation today. Jackson, I did have a question, and this is probably less of a planning issue, but has Dover done anything with parking regulations to allow ticketing or towing of people who are parked in charging spaces and not actively charging? Because that can be a big problem as well.
That's a good question. So these amendments really deal with private development. In our parking garage, we have a system. We have some charging stations there. They're level 2. We have a system where folks actually pay like they would for a normal parking space, so by the hour. And then there's an added fee to cover the electricity at those parking sites. So they would be ticketed just like anyone else would. And I suppose if they left it there long enough, they would be towed. But that's something we're really going to have to take into account as we consider expanding our municipal public charging. And that's something we're obviously looking to do. So that's a good question.
Thanks.
And then let me see, is there another? May have been another hand. Nope, that's that. I think there may have been another question came in. All right, so I'll just make kind of a last call. If anybody else has any questions, either to put them in the chat box now or raise your hand. Okay, not seeing anything else. So I just want to remind folks, well, first, thank you so much, Jackson and Jessica. This was very, very informative. I did put the link to the OPD planning and training webpage in the chat. I will also note, although not on the slide deck, the OPD annual planning and zoning conference is coming up on April 30th and May 7th. Our deadline for registration does close tomorrow. I just put the link in the chat too. It's 2 half-day online conferences, again, using Microsoft Teams. So folks, if you haven't already, please register for that as well. And our next plan webinar, we have not finalized the date yet or the topic yet, but the next plan webinar should tentatively be Thursday, May 19th at noon. So please mark that on your calendar. And with that, thank you very much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks all. I appreciate it.